thanks again to the Blauvelt Free Library for hosting another one of my presentations. And I can't believe that it's finally almost upon us. This special event is going to involve two shadows cast by the moon. This large shadow that you see that's roughly about, I would say 6,000 miles across, that's the penumbra. And from the penumbral shadow, you will see at least a part of the sun eclipsed by the moon. But where you see that dark dot, and that dot runs approximately 125 miles in diameter, if you are anywhere along the path of that dark dot, that is the umbra, the dark shadow of the moon, from which you would see the sun in total eclipse. That is the place to be. And as it turns out, for the first time in 99 years, New York State is going to be within the path of the upcoming total eclipse. The last time there was a total eclipse over New York was back in January of 1925. And now here we are looking at another opportunity that's going to be provided to us a week from this coming Monday. You can see here is the band of totality, again, roughly 125 miles wide. And these ovals here are the outlines of the umbral shadow of the moon as it moves literally at a rapid speed. I mean, we're talking about the shadow moving at a rate of about 3,000 miles per hour. That's why the total phase of the eclipse won't be able to last much longer than just shy of 4 minutes. You've got this shadow racing along at thousands of miles an hour. And again, as you can see, it will be passing over western and upstate New York. Places within the eclipse track include Niagara Falls, Buffalo, Rochester. Syracuse is just inside of the total eclipse zone. Also Watertown, Plattsburgh. I have a hotel reservation up in Plattsburgh, and beyond, across the border in Canada, Canada's largest city, Montreal, will be in the zone of totality as well. Now, consider this. Consider that scientists, astronomers, astrophysicists, as I take a sip here for a moment, when you consider scientists travel halfway around the world, literally at times, to be inside the zone of a total eclipse, spend a lot of time, a lot of money in order to be able to say that they can bask in the shadow of the moon for a few short minutes. Consider that, and now consider the fact that here is an eclipse, a total eclipse, that is knocking at our back door, literally. So you may want to stay in Rockland County and Blauvelt or the tri-state area on that day at 3:25 that afternoon locally. We'll see about 91% of the sun covered. But you want to really take a piece of advice from somebody who is going to be seeing his 14th total eclipse in a week. If I were you, I would make plans to try and get into the zone of the total eclipse. From Rockland County, all you have to do is get in a car and travel on Interstate 87 straight north past Syracuse and, past Albany, Schenectady, Saratoga Springs, and get into the lower end of the Adirondack Range. That's about, 4 hours from here. 4 hours to see one of the greatest spectacles that your eyes have ever beheld, if you have never seen one before. If you have seen one before, you know what I'm talking about. And in fact, this talk is going to deal with not all of my 13 eclipses, but some of the most noteworthy, in my opinion, some funny stories, some poignant stories concerning my chase of the lunar shadow over the last half century or so. So just give me one more moment here to get a couple of things going. Here we go. And away we go with my talk, which is Adventures of an Eclipse Chaser. And my name again is Joe Rao. And again, if you have any questions afterwards, by all means, I will be happy to take them, either from the audience that is gathered at the library or from someone who wants to ask a question online. Now, as you probably have already gotten the idea from my descriptions, who among us would not marvel at the spectacle of a total solar eclipse. No spectacle that nature has to offer can rival a total eclipse of the sun for sheer drama and excitement. It's not just something that you see, it's something that, well, those of you who perhaps have been lucky enough to see for yourselves a total solar eclipse have come to realize that it is an experience. Every fiber of you becomes involved during those precious moments of totality. And of course, at the beginning and the end, we have those magnificently beautiful diamond ring effects that grace our skies. They become indelibly implanted into your memories, and they remain a lifetime once you have been there where the shadow of the moon strikes the earth. Here is a picture of yours truly with his very, very best friend, and I still say that she is my very best friend, in spite of the fact that on September 1st, we will be married 40 years. That is my wife, Renata, and I'm next to her. And the reason why we are bundled up like that, this was our last total eclipse adventure. I had traveled in December of 2021 to see a total solar eclipse from Antarctica. This was taken from Paulet Island, right off the coast of Antarctica. You see my solar eclipse patch on my Parker there. And if you also look just off of my shoulder, you'll see a sea lion lounging in the relatively warm sunshine. It's summertime in the southern hemisphere in December. And on this particular day, although we looked like we're bundled up for 0 degrees, it actually was quite warm. It was about 30 degrees that day. And as you can see, that sea lion taking full advantage of that, basking in the sunshine in Antarctica. That shows you what kind of a nut I am, that I'll actually travel all the way down to near the South Pole to see one of these things. Here's another shot that was taken from a cruise ship. I had convinced a cruise line that is no longer in business. It was called Regal Cruises, and they offered whale watching cruises from New England and parts of Atlantic Canada. And I had told them in August of 1999, not too far from where they would normally pass by near Nova Scotia, that they could see a total eclipse of the sun. And sure enough, you can see this view was taken some minutes after the sun came up. And you can imagine what kind of a sunrise it was. We saw the sun come up beyond the horizon, looking like lobster claws, if you will. Most of the sun behind the moon, and then the lobster claws or the crescent got thinner and thinner. And here you see the moment of the diamond ring leading into 50 seconds of glorious totality for this particular solar eclipse. These are just two of my eclipse adventures. We'll get back to those in just a moment. The gentleman that you see on the screen now, very distinguished. You ever notice that when the Hollywood, when they did movies, science fiction movies or science movies, grade B, back in the 1940s or 50s, if they needed somebody to portray an astronomer, they always seemed to come up with somebody who looks like this. But this is a photograph from the 19th century. Gentleman's name is Charles A. Young, and on August 7th of 1869, he traveled to Burlington, Iowa, with his prism spectroscope. Professor Young was hoping to discover what the corona, that beautiful crown of light that appears during the total phase of a solar eclipse, he wanted to find out or try to discover what exactly the corona was composed of. He went to Davenport with his assistant, William Harkness, and Harkness, during the moment when the sun went into totality, handed Professor Young a lantern to read the micrometer head on his spectroscope, because it gets rather dark during a total eclipse of the sun. And so you need something like a lantern. So he hands Professor Young the lantern to read the micrometer head. And now here it is in total eclipse, and Harkness looks up into the sky at the totally eclipsed sun. Remember, Professor Young was concentrating not on the sun, not on the sky. He's concentrating on the spectroscope. He's reading the spectroscopic lines to try to derive what the corona was made of. His assistant, however, hands him the lantern, looks up at the totally eclipsed sun, and he says, "Oh my God, look at that!" And in the aftermath of the eclipse, in his diary or in his memoir, Professor Young wrote the following. He said, "I looked over my shoulder for just an instant and beheld the most beautiful and impressive spectacle upon which my eyes ever rested. It couldn't have been more than 5 seconds," he said, "but the effect was so overwhelming so as to drive away all certain recollections of what I had just seen on the spectroscope." He adds that, "I cannot describe the sensation of surprise and mortification and of personal imbecility and wasted opportunity that overwhelmed me when the sunlight flashed out." So I can only assume that Professor Young became so emotionally overwrought that it may have produced a sort of paralysis. I can visualize this old man just staring, absolutely transfixed, and down the drain probably went many weeks of preparation and dry runs. But Professor Young is not the only person who is affected or was affected by the sight of a solar eclipse. This young man certainly was. In fact, this young man in this photograph is speaking to you right now. This is yours truly when I was just about 7 years old. You can see that clunker in the background there to date this photograph. But when I was just about 7, I was treated to my first view of an eclipse. It was not a total eclipse, and it was pointed out to me by my grandfather, who told me on a summer Saturday, July 20th, 1963, that's over 60 years ago, my God, that he said, "Joey," he said, "later this afternoon, we're going to have an eclipse." And I said to my grandfather, "Well, what's an eclipse?" I didn't know what it was, 6 years old, 7 years old. So I still remember like it was yesterday, getting my first lesson in celestial mechanics. He took the salt and pepper shaker off of the kitchen shelf, put them on the table, kitchen table. Then he made a fist and said, "Pretend my fist is the sun, the salt shaker is the moon, the pepper shaker is the earth. Later today, the salt shaker, or in this case the moon, is going to pass mostly in front of the sun, and we're going to get a view of an eclipse. The moon is going to block out a good part of the sun, in fact, about 90% of the sun." And so, and remembering that day, it was a big story. That day, a lot of people talking about it. Here you see kids who are getting corrugated cardboard boxes because they were going to make solar eclipse projectors. They were going to put a pinhole on one side of the box, and then let the sun shine through the box onto the opposite side to project the image. Other kids had, telescopes looking up. You could see the beginning of the eclipse up there. Other people used dark exposed photographic film. You remember what film is, right? You remember what cameras were. I mean, everybody uses their phone now to take pictures. But back in the day, 60 years ago, you'd go to the drugstore, get black and white film, expose it to the sun, have it developed, and then the film was very, very dark, and you'd be able to watch the eclipse through it. Here you see the kids looking at the projected images through the box of the sun, and other people projecting the image through binoculars or telescopes. Now, I must tell you that on that day in 1963, it was very cloudy in New York. I was living in the Bronx, Throgs Neck, but just as the eclipse was reaching its peak, this view of the sun attenuated the light of the sun by the clouds. The clouds thinned out and parted and gave us a view of a beautiful crescent sun up in the sky. And I don't know, it just, when I saw this in the sky, just bowled me over. It was a pretty amazing spectacle for me. And after the eclipse was over and we went inside to have dinner, I was just, as my grandmother would say, a little chatterbox. I'm talking about the eclipse. I'm saying, my goodness, that was an amazing sight. And my grandfather, upon hearing all of this, says at the kitchen table, to no one in particular, "I made a big mistake today. We shouldn't have stayed here in the Bronx. We should have gone to Maine, because in the state of Maine that afternoon, the path of totality, that's the zone where the total eclipse would be visible, crossed right through the middle of Maine." And he said that is where we could have seen a total eclipse. And I got to tell you, Joey, that is a sight to be seen. And he spoke from experience, because when he was 16 years old, in January of 1925, a total eclipse was visible right here in New York City. You can see the banner headline, "Eclipse," a little late in the New York area, but the city, the entire city halted to gaze. It thrilled the millions. And my grandfather saw that eclipse, again, as a 16-year-old from the East River Drive in Upper Manhattan on 119th Street, now known as the FDR Drive. And he's relating this to me at the kitchen table. He says, "Oh, that was so great. The sky got dark and the sun." And then he made a promise to me right then and there. He said, "If we have another chance sometime in the future where there's another total eclipse that's within range or close by to us, I will take you to see that eclipse. I will, because you must see a total solar eclipse." And indeed, his promise to me was came true 9 years later. In July of 1972, July the 10th, my grandfather loaded my mom, my sister, his wife, my grandmother, in his beat-up Plymouth Fury, and we traveled north along Interstate 87 across the border to Montreal. We stayed one night in Montreal, and then the next day we went to Quebec City, and then on the morning of the 10th of July, we traveled from Quebec up along the roadway adjacent to the St. Lawrence Seaway up to Cap-Chat on the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec, where, as you can see, they were right in the middle of the path of the total solar eclipse that would occur later that afternoon. And Cap-Chat, describe Cap-Chat to you. If any of you ever saw, and how many of us have not, ever watched the Andy Griffith Show, Cap-Chat was the French version of Mayberry. About 2,000 people normally populated, or was the population of Cap-Chat, and about 30,000 people descended upon Cap-Chat for the eclipse that afternoon. I still remember my grandfather maneuvering through the few roads that were open, so many people coming and going. I could have sworn I saw somebody who looked very much like Don Knotts or Barney Fife trying to direct traffic, except he's doing it in French because there's so many people going every which way, jockeying for position to see the eclipse. It got so bad in town with so many people that my grandfather said, "You know what? We're not going to stay here. We're going to travel outside of town. We're going to go a few miles out." And it's a good thing that he made that decision. Here you see both my grandmother and grandfather, and they're looking through their exposed piece of photographic film at the partial phases of the eclipse. These photographs that you see here were taken not by me, but by someone who was going to become a very close and dear friend of mine, Glenn Schneider. Glenn, I've known him for over 50 years, did not know him at the eclipse. He was only, I would say, maybe 500 or 600 yards away from me for the eclipse. And as you can see, Glenn's photograph, you see how the moon moving in front of the sun, but also moving in front of the sun were clouds. And the clouds were increasing and thickening as the eclipse progressed. In fact, it got to the point where we were wondering who's going to cover up the sun completely first, the clouds or the moon. This picture in the lower right was the last picture that Glenn was able to take. Right after he snapped this picture, and look at how exceedingly thick the crescent is. Right after he took that photo, the sun went behind a thick cloud, and totality for his vantage point was lost. He got skunked. He missed out on the 2+ minutes of total eclipse. I, again, was probably no more than 500 or 600 yards away from where he was. But you know how they say sometimes baseball is a game of inches? Sometimes eclipse chasing can be a game of yards, feet, or miles. In this case, even though we were relatively close, I too lost sight of the sun when it went into total eclipse. But unlike Glenn, 30 seconds after totality, the sun dropped out of the clouds and into view. And this is the view that I had from my vantage point in Cap-Chat. And we did, unlike Glenn, get a chance to see the final 90 seconds of total eclipse. Oh, that was a beautiful sight. Oh, again, if you've never seen one, you must. It is a spectacular view. You see the darkened disk of the sun and the corona. And again, a pretty amazing sight. And here is an amazing picture of the guy who's speaking to you right now. I tell people this photograph was taken 52 years and 100 pounds ago. You see me there standing in front of standing to one side of my 4¼ inch telescope where I was able to view the eclipse. It was great. It was wonderful. And my grandfather um, told me after the drive back to Quebec City that night, as we were all going to bed, he said, "I'll bet you will remember this day for as long as you live," and it is absolutely true. I've seen many eclipses, but the best one of all was the first one, like your first kiss or making love for the first time. For me, the first eclipse will always be the most memorable. Now, my friend Glenn, who got skunked at that same eclipse, he and I got to know each other very well because we met 6 months later at the Hall of Science in Flushing, Queens. The Hall of Science was one of those leftover exhibits from the 1964-65 New York World's Fair. Still exists today. You can still visit it. It's in Flushing. And in 1973, the Hall of Science installed a planetarium, a small planetarium. And they were asking if there are any people, high schoolers or youngsters who would be interested in coming to the Hall of Science on weekends and volunteering to give sky shows. Well, Glenn volunteered, I volunteered. That's where we met. And we were surprised. I mean, first of all, we were both Bronx boys. We lived within several miles of each other, although we never knew it until we met at the Hall of Science. Second, we were enthusiastic amateur astronomers with a special affinity for the phenomenon of eclipses. In fact, both of us were turned on to eclipses by our grandfathers, both of whom were immigrants to this great country. My Italian grandfather was Mario. Glenn's Jewish grandfather was Max. And Mario and Max were witnesses to that 1925 eclipse in New York and conveyed its beauty and grandeur to their grandsons. And interestingly, Mario and Max were both born on the very same day, Thursday, December 17th, 1908. I often ask Glenn, I say, are you sure we're not related some way? Or if not related, certainly it would seem like we're joined at the hip. In 1977, Glenn calls me up on the phone and says, "How would you like to see the total eclipse of the sun that's going to occur later this year in October?" Well, I knew exactly where that eclipse was going to go. First of all, it wasn't in this country. It was going to be in a foreign land, South America. The country would be Colombia. And you see the two green lines indicating the path of the total eclipse. The eclipse would pass to the north of the capital city of Bogota and into the wild and woolly country land of Cundinamarca. And I said, "So how are we going to see this eclipse?" And he said, "I have a perfect suggestion. We'll run a tour." I said, "We're going to run a tour?" He said, "Yeah, why don't we?" He says, "We know everything about astronomy and we know everything about eclipses. We can run a tour. We'll take out an ad in some of the magazines, astronomy magazines, Sky and Telescope. And if we get enough people, we'll be able to see the eclipse for a big discount, the two of us. Or maybe even if we get a lot of people, we'll be able to see it for free." Well, that didn't happen. But we were able to coerce or cajole 20 people to join up on this tour that Glenn and I put together to go see the total eclipse of the sun. Now, I got to tell you something. Of the 20 people that came, the demographic, the average age of those people on this tour were generally in the late 40s or early to mid 50s. That's what the age group. We had two women on the tour that were close to 80 years old. Now, can you imagine signing on for a tour to a foreign country, South America, in this case, Colombia? You meet at the airport and you meet your tour guides, the two people who are running the tour. And these are the two guys who are running the tour. We were both tykes, tiny tykes. We were both 21 years old. And in fact, Glenn was going to be celebrating his 22nd birthday on the day of the eclipse, October 12th, 1977, Columbus Day. And in Colombia, Columbus Day was a national holiday. Everybody celebrates on Columbus Day in Colombia, and everybody now, upon hearing about the total eclipse, very, very excited that this was coming to their country, their homeland. Now, we learned a lot of things, Glenn and I, two kids, with this tour that we were running. One of the things that we learned is that if you're going to be running a tour and you're going to need a chartered bus, make sure that the bus is in good working order. This bus that you see here, if I had $1 for every time this bus broke down, very tempestuous engine. If I had $1, I would be a rich man. This was not the most reliable vehicle, but this was the only thing that we had available to us. This was the bus that was going to take us from Bogota up to the north into the zone of totality. And along the way, we passed across a number of different towns and villages, and we stopped occasionally to talk about the eclipse with the natives. Here I am showing one of the people who lived. I believe this was taken in the town of Subachoque, Colombia, showing you how you can use a dark photographic piece of film to look at the eclipse later that afternoon. And here we are. Here's a group of us, again, in another town. I think this was in the town of El Rosal. And it was right about this time, as we were roughly about, I think, halfway to the spot that we had chose to see the eclipse. We were traveling on a small, narrow, but paved road that this gentleman, and this gentleman's name is Tomas. Tomas was our bus driver. And he comes up to Glenn and I think, again, when we were in the town of El Rosal, and he says, Senors, he says, I know a way, how you say, a shortcut to get to where you want to see the phenomenon, the eclipse. He said, if you would like, I will take the shortcut and we could get there faster. Well, Glenn and I, upon hearing this, he said, yeah, that might be a good idea. I mean, it's if we can get there quicker, we'd have more time to set up our equipment. And so we told Tomas, stupidly, I might add, yeah, take us on the shortcut. And what Tomas did not tell us is that he had not been on this route for 7 years. What he also didn't tell us is that this particular route was not a paved road. It was a dirt road filled with a lot of ruts and even a few large potholes. And every time I traveled over a big rut or a pothole, I said to myself, I wish I brought a package of Dramamine with me. All of this was en route to trying to see the zone of the eclipse. This was the first faint, feeble call of the Greek chorus of tragedy, making itself felt. And Glenn and I, like a couple of boobs, like Candide, we thought everything was going to be okay in spite of it. As I said, we got on this dirt road and we encountered a tropical shower. Now, I know many of you have probably been in the summertime outside when a heavy shower has hit or a thunderstorm has hit and the rain comes pounding down, a veritable downpour. You have not seen rain come down really hard until you've been in the tropics. We didn't encounter a downpour, we encountered a drownpour. And now if you encounter a heavy rainstorm like that, and you're driving on a dirt road filled with ruts and pits and whatever, what's going to happen on that dirt road with all of that rain? Right! The road is going to turn to mud. And not too much longer before the bus that we had got stuck in the mud. And what did we have to do? We had to ask our 20 paying passengers, the 20 people who paid to be on this trip, to please, could you go get out and let's help Tomas push the bus out of the mud. And then we realized we couldn't go much further because of the state of the road. So now Tomas had to spend about an hour to slowly, and I underscore that word slowly, turn the bus around on this narrow dirt or mud road. And we had to go back now toward El Rosal. Thankfully, one of the merchants was kind enough to allow us to use his store so that we all could get cleaned up, get rid of a lot of the mud that was on our shoes and on our pants and whatever. But now we had wasted so much time with the bus and the mud and whatever. The eclipse was about to begin. And so now what we did was we, instead of taking the route which we couldn't on the muddy road, we got back on the road that we should have taken, the paved road. We couldn't get to the middle of the eclipse track where we would have gotten about a minute of totality. So we could only make it part way in, and as a result, we would see only about 38 seconds of total eclipse. If we were able to see it at all. You see, as I said, we had this big rainstorm, and after the storm was over, here you see one of the passengers, one of our people on our tour, Alden Wells from Sturbridge, Massachusetts, and he's pointing at the beginning of the eclipse to the one patch of blue sky that was in evidence at the time of the eclipse. But in the minutes that followed after the picture was taken, the blue sky began to open up. The opening in the clouds opened up more and more and more and more until eventually we had about 75 or 80% clear skies, clear sunny skies. And here you see Glenn breaking out his telescope and projecting the image on on a piece of white card. I think he was pointing out a sunspot on this in this picture. And like 10 minutes before the total eclipse was about to arrive, Glenn waltzes up to me and he says, "We've got it. It's in the bag. We're going to see totality. At least that'll be something after all that we've been through today." He spoke a little too soon. 5 minutes before total eclipse, remember I said 75 to 80% of the sky was bright and sunny, but that also meant that about 20 to 25% was still with some cloud cover. And one of those clouds, like the Goodyear blimp, broke off and started drifting in the direction of the sun. And we're seeing this and looking at this and saying, "Oh, no, no, no." And just about a minute or two before the total eclipse, the cloud passed in front of the sun. Remember, I told you the totality would only be about 38 seconds. And so during that 38 seconds of totality, this was our view of the totally eclipsed sun behind that cloud. And you see this red light here on the outer fringe of the sun, just as it goes into totality, or just after it begins to move out of totality. There's that red fringe called the chromosphere. Beautiful ruby red, or sometimes electric pink in color. And it's a beautiful sight, but we couldn't see it. But the light from the chromosphere was lighting up the edge of the cloud with a kind of a reddish coloration here. And so that was it. That was it. And of course, naturally, after totality was over, the cloud said, "Oh, thank you very much," and moved on. And what we saw now was a thin crescent sun, but it was widening now, waxing, because the total phase was over, and now the eclipse was diminishing. And one thing that we did not expect to see, at sunset, the sun was setting behind a distant radio tower while still in partial eclipse. This sight probably would have been the icing on the cake, except the cake unfortunately fell flat when we missed totality. As you would expect, it was a very quiet and somber bus ride back to Bogota. And when we returned to the United States, we were licking our proverbial wounds for at least a few weeks. But then another eclipse was looming, one that was going to happen in February of 1979. And this time, that eclipse, which we called Blackout 79, was going to occur in our part of the country, our part of the world. Not our part of the country, we're all the way over here, but this eclipse would sweep in from the Pacific Ocean, across the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Plains, and then on up across the border into Canada, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And Glenn, since we were thinking about running another tour, we were gluttons for punishment. He said, if we run another tour this time we got to know, we learned, as I said, a lot of things from our failure in Colombia. He said, look at the weather information, the long-term weather data, and find a place along the eclipse track which you feel would give us the best chance of clear sky and good weather. I did. I examined the eclipse track, went through a lot of weather information, which gave us data going back, quite a few decades, and made the decision that the best place that we could possibly see this eclipse is in Lewistown. You see, here's Montana, and here is North Dakota. Here's Bismarck outside of the eclipse track, but I chose the little town of Lewistown, Montana. We would fly in from New York to Great Falls, and then get a hotel there, and then we would drive on a bus, actually 2 buses. Would you believe we actually coerced 80 people to come on our eclipse tour to see this eclipse? And so that's where we were going to go to, Lewistown, Montana. And the year before the eclipse, in March of 1978, Glenn and I worked up a kind of a press release or a news release and sent that news release to the newspaper in Lewistown, the Lewistown News Argus. And in the release, we declared Lewistown, Montana is the eclipse capital of the world. And the gentleman who wrote the story, Dave Byerly here, called me on the phone and said, is this a joke? Is this true? Are we actually going to see a total eclipse of the sun? I said, yes, your town, your little community is right in the center of the path of the total eclipse next year in February of 1979. And they made a big deal about this. I mean, well, you can see here, in the newspaper, the first line in the newspaper story, another feather has been placed in Lewistown's cap. I never did find out, by the way, what the other feathers were. I mean, to me, a total eclipse coming to your town, that is indeed a big feather. But what else could compare to that in Lewistown? Again, they were right in the middle of big sky country. And, you could look for miles and miles in all directions, see nothing. But the town, getting very excited about this. When we arrived, the first thing that we did was we didn't go to Lewistown. We went to Great Falls and we went to the National Weather Service office. We made acquaintance with the MIC, the meteorologist in charge. His name was William Rammer. I'm sorry to say or report Mr. Rammer, who you see here, just passed away about a month or two ago. He was 97 years old. He lived a good, long, full life. But in 1979, he was the head of the Weather Service in Great Falls, and he provided us with all the weather information leading right up to the time of the eclipse. And that was a good thing, as you'll soon find out. So you see, here I am. This is Keith Eichner. You're going to hear Keith's voice in a few moments. Keith was a meteorologist who did TV weather in Minneapolis, and he was on our tour as well. The night before the eclipse, and this is before I became a TV weatherman here in the Hudson Valley. I didn't get my job at News 12 until 1995. This is 1979. But the night before the eclipse, using the information from what Mr. Rammer was providing, I gave a complete dissertation about the weather prospects for our viewing the eclipse the following day at the hotel that we were staying at. We were staying at the Yogo Inn. This was taken in the ballroom of the Yogo Inn. You see this guy holding the microphone? This was from Helena, Montana. The TV station in Helena was covering our little expedition. And so they ran my discussion live in Helena, Montana, the night before the eclipse. And I said to myself, this is probably the first time I was ever doing TV weather in 1979 when I was just a mere 23 years old. But later that night, I received some information from Mr. Rammer indicating that there would be clouds approaching our area the next morning. And the last thing I wanted to hear, was clouds after what we went through in Columbia. So I told Glenn, I think it would be good to pile everybody into the two buses that we had chartered and take those two buses to the east. We were going to try to outrace the cloud cover, get away from the clouds that were advancing toward us from the west, and get into a zone of clearer sky. You see Glenn here looking at the latest information from Mr. Rammer. That's his then girlfriend, Susan. And that's the decision that we made. So the next morning, we got our 80 people from our two groups. As you can see, the buses were just a little bit better, a little more reliable than what we had in Columbia. And so we loaded everybody on the bus, the equipment that they carried with them to watch the eclipse, and away we went. We traveled on the road, I think it was Route 200, for about an hour, almost an hour and a half. Traveling, looking for a spot where we could set up a nice large field where we can observe the eclipse. And eventually we came across this, a big field, perfect for viewing the eclipse. And there was a barn and a farmhouse. And we stopped the two buses. I got out of my bus, Glenn got out of his. And together, the two of us trudged up to the house, knocked on the door. The door opens up, and the guy who opens the door, his name was, we later found out his name was Artie. If any of you remember the TV show Dennis the Menace, and you remember Joseph Kearns, who played Mr. Wilson on that show, Dennis the Menace, this guy was the doppelganger. This guy looked exactly like Mr. Wilson. So the door opens up, and I'm saying, oh my God, it's Mr. Wilson. But yeah, Glenn did all the talking. He said, excuse me, sir, we're from New York, and we're here to observe the eclipse of the sun, which is going to begin any moment now, in the next few minutes. He said, could you possibly allow us to set up our equipment on your big field out there? Because we need a place to set up. We got a lot of people with cameras and telescopes and whatever. And Mr. Wilson, or Artie in this case, he breaks into a big smile and he says, so you people came like, how many times does this guy see two busloads of people stop in front of his house? I mean, like I said, you can see in the background there the beautiful Judith Mountains. I mean, this is like in the middle of nowhere. And he said, "You people came all the way from New York, and you're here to see the eclipse, and you'd want to know if you want to use my field." He said, "Well, go ahead. Go ahead. You can use my field." He said, "Look, it'd be a different story, mind you, if it were July and August. But right now, it's February. The only thing I'm growing out there right now is grass, sagebrush, and snow. Go ahead. Use the field. Do whatever you'd like." And I turned around. I gave a thumbs up to my bus. Glenn gives a thumbs up to his bus. You never saw 80 people come piling out of those two buses very quickly because it was time coming up on eclipse time, setting up their cameras, their telescopes, all their equipment, tripods. And here we are on Artie's field in the snow, looking up at the sun through welder's glass or special photographic filters so that we could look and watch the partial phases of the eclipse. Here's one young happy guy. There I was, big smile on my face because I could see that the clouds that were coming in from the west, we had pretty much outran those clouds. We weren't going to be bothered by them. And so we were going to now see the eclipse and hopefully also see totality. Now, what you're about to hear is Keith Eichner. Remember, we met him at the Weather Service office. He was trying to do a professional narration of the eclipse, the various phases. And you're also going to see photographs, snippets of our view of the eclipse. What we're going to do is we're going to start this 2 minutes before the total eclipse. 2 minutes before totality, the sky was growing very dark. That darkness was the giant shadow of the moon approaching from the west. And now, again, we're going to start the audio at this point, and you're going to hear Keith, again, trying his best to stay calm, but unfortunately, at totality, he and just about everybody else on that field lost it when the sun went into total eclipse.
It is getting spooky. It does look like a storm gathering now up to the west. It's a thin crescent, about 98% now. I got a microphone here if you want it. Here we are. 1% before totality now. 1 minute before totality or less. Got it? Okay. Unbelievable. Oh, this is unbelievable. Oh, my God. I don't believe this. This is unreal. Look at this Bailey speed. We got Bailey speed. Oh, yeah, we got it. Oh, that's beautiful. Look at the glow in the sky. You can see that the shadow is elliptical shape. I forgot to start. Well, don't worry about it. Shit, I forgot to start mine. Just take pictures. Oh, look at the prominences. Anybody with binoculars, look at the prominences. They're absolutely fantastic. Look at the red all around. Look at the red. Oh, my God, look at the silhouettes of the sky. Oh, I got to see another one. This is unreal. Here it comes. Here it comes. 4, 3, 2, 1. There goes the shadow. All right. 3 cheers for the eclipse.
And you might say that we avenged our disaster from 2 years ago in Colombia. A couple of guys ran up behind me and just put me on their shoulders like the proverbial end of the football game. I'm only excited that they decided to pour Gatorade on me because temperatures were in the 20s. It would have been awfully cold and I would have been awfully wet. And that night, back in Great Falls, Glenn and I, again, at the celebratory dinner, we had one large bunch of happy eclipse campers having just seen this amazing sight. One of the people who was not with us but saw the same eclipse but in his homeland of Canada, Gimli, Manitoba, was this gentleman. His name is Terrence Dickinson. I knew Terry. He was editor of a short-lived magazine in astronomy, Star and Sky. I'm sad to report he died a year ago. He is I guess you could say, the Neil deGrasse Tyson of Canada, or was, well known, highly regarded throughout one end of Canada to the other, well known for writing many astronomy books, and also revered as a very highly regarded astrophotographer. And at this eclipse in 1979, Terry was going to photograph for him his very first total eclipse of the sun, or at least he was going to try to. As you can see here in his words, as totality moved in, he said, "I was totally unprepared for the awesome beauty and overwhelming power of a total eclipse. I was overwhelmed, incapable of performing even the most rudimentary tasks." He said, I knew immediately that I would never be able to photograph the event. It was commanding me to use every second of time viewing and to let my eyes soak up the image. I wrenched the camera off my telescope. Again, he is highly regarded for photographing celestial objects. And here's a total eclipse of the sun, and he took the camera off the telescope. He wrenched the camera off his telescope, and he said, "I quickly slipped an eyepiece into the focuser and then gazed on what was the most stunning and awesomely beautiful astronomical image I've ever seen." In some ways, it sounds very much like our dear friend Professor Young from a century earlier, when he was trying to make observations of the eclipse with his spectroscope. That went by the wayside, and taking a photograph here went completely by the wayside with Terence Dickinson as well. My next eclipse was 11 years later, and here's an eclipse I didn't even expect to see. This eclipse would be passing over Siberia, and also passing over the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. So, as you can see here in Sky and Telescope in their July 1990 edition, that was the month of the eclipse, they said it's going to be elusive, there'll be fog, there'll be low clouds. There's no real way you're going to see it unless you see it from the air. And then they had a map. This map was simply to tell people out in the far western United States that you might be able to see this eclipse just before sunset, the finishing or ending stages of the eclipse. This particular eclipse would be total. You see the total phase of the eclipse here, coming down through the Aleutians and then ending somewhere out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And when I saw this map, I said to myself, this is interesting. Here is San Francisco, and here is Honolulu. And I said, I wonder if possibly there might be a flight from San Francisco to Honolulu, or maybe from Honolulu to San Francisco, that just might be over the ocean at the time that the eclipse is occurring, and might possibly interact with the shadow of the moon and allow people on board that flight, this particular flight, to see a total eclipse of the sun. And we did not have in 1990, well, maybe we did, but if it was in its infant stages, the internet that we know today. I guess Al Gore hadn't invented the internet yet. This, again, was July of 1990. So how was I going to find? I couldn't go on Travelocity or Expedia.com. How would I find out about any airlines that were going to be going from San Francisco to Honolulu or vice versa? So I went to my local library. At that time, I was living in Levittown, Long Island. And I went to the Levittown Library, and I don't even know if this book is still printed. It may very well not, because it'd be just a big waste of paper. You can do all of this on your computer now. But it was called the Official Airline Guide. It came out every month, and it was about the size of the Brooklyn or Queens phone directory. What this book was a book that would tell you every single commercial flight from every corner of the globe. If, for example, you wanted to go from Omaha, Nebraska to Tokyo, Japan, you would consult this book. This book would tell you all the flights, all the times to and from Tokyo to Omaha, or vice versa, all of the flights. So what I did was I went to my library, and I spent a couple of hours with the latest edition of the book, the July 1990 edition, to find an airline or airlines that might possibly have a flight that would be in the general vicinity of the total eclipse, again, in between Honolulu and San Francisco. And you know what? I did find a flight. This company does not exist anymore. It went out of business in 2008. The name of the airline was American Transair. They were based in Indianapolis. And on that particular day of the eclipse, it was Saturday, July 21st, 1990, That flight, Flight 402 from Honolulu to San Francisco, would be in the general vicinity of the shadow of the moon out over the Pacific Ocean. So I contacted American Transair, and you're going to do something crazy like this, you need to have somebody on your side. The guy I spoke with sounded very, very interested in this. I said, think about it. Here's something, a bonus for your passengers. You'll be able to see a total eclipse of the sun. And he said, well, I'm going to bump this up to corporate. A couple of days later, the corporate people called, and we got a conference call. And they said, yeah, we'd love to do it. We'd love to be able to do it. And that's when I dropped the bomb on them. And I said, well, if you're going to do it, I have to tell you one thing. According to my calculations, you have to delay the flight. Delay the flight? On purpose? You want us to delay a flight? I said, yeah. You'd have to delay the flight, Flight 402 from Honolulu to San Francisco, by 41 minutes. He said, well, why do you want to do that? I said, if you delay it by 41 minutes, then when we get to the spot where the shadow of the moon is going to be, that will be where we'll intercept the shadow and see the total eclipse. If we go at the regular time, we won't see a total eclipse. We'll see only a partial eclipse. But if we delay the flight from Honolulu to San Francisco, we will be able to probably intercept the eclipse. And it took them a little while to think about that. And they said, yeah, you know what? We're going to do it. We're still going to do it. It sounds like a great idea, a great plan. And that's what we did. And here you see not only myself on this flight, but also my wife, which you saw earlier in Antarctica with me. She goes on all of my crazy adventures. There's Renata. There is my friend Sam Storch, an assiduous amateur astronomer who was also the best man at my wedding. And Craig Small. This flag was actually made by Craig. He calls it his lucky charm. He's been to something like 30 eclipses, and every time he has gone, he's brought the flag with him, and he's never been clouded out of an eclipse. He's always had clear weather or good weather for all of the eclipses that he's in. And now this time, he's going to go on this flight with Sam and Renata and myself. And so here's the craziness of this whole deal. So on Friday night, July 20th, we left JFK Airport and flew to San Francisco. We arrived in San Francisco at 12:30 in the morning, local time, Saturday morning. We got a couple of rooms at the local airport hotel. The next morning, we left the hotel to go back to the airport. We got on Flight 403 from San Francisco to Honolulu. We got off the plane in Honolulu. We were off the plane for 45 minutes while they cleaned the plane up. It would be the same aircraft that we would use to see the eclipse. 45 minutes later, we got back on board this Flight 402 to see the eclipse, because now we're going back from Honolulu to San Francisco. I told my wife, by the way, don't ever say I don't take you any place. I mean, like, we were in Honolulu for all of 45 minutes before we headed on back to the mainland. And here on the bulletin board at the airport in Honolulu, you see American Transair Flight 402. The time is 3:20. But what the passengers did not know is that we were going to move that flight up to 4:01. Again, we were going to delay the flight by 41 minutes. And Bob Leary, Captain Bob, as he asked me to call him, who was going to be the captain on board our flight, I said to Captain Bob, I said, so you're going to tell everybody we're delaying the flight 41 minutes? He said, no. He said, I'm leaving that up to you. And so I got on board the PA system in the plane. It was a big plane, an L-1011 jet, over 300 passengers. And I explained to them why we were purposely delaying the flight. When I said the flight is going to be delayed, you heard like a moan throughout the plane. Like, oh. And I said, no. He said, we're doing it for a reason. All of you who are interested, we're going to see a total eclipse of the sun if everything works out. Now, after we took off, and this is before 9/11, believe it or not, before 9/11, if you were a passenger on board any commercial flight and you wanted to say something or convey something to the captain, you could talk to the flight attendant, one of the stewardesses, and if it was a good enough reason, you would actually be escorted into the cockpit so that you could talk with the captain or the navigator while the plane was in flight. Don't even bother to try to do that today. There's no way in the world in the aftermath of 9/11. But before then, 1990, I had free access. I could go in as I pleased into the cockpit, the flight deck, and it was after we took off and I was looking at the dashboard of the plane that I noticed something on the plane. I noticed the clock that said 4:13. That's Greenwich Mean Time. Now, when I made the arrangements with American Transair, I said to them, we had to be at that spot over the Pacific Ocean at 4:10 Greenwich Mean Time. But on Captain Leary's dashboard, I'm seeing 4:13. So I said to Captain Leary, I said, why does it say 4:13? And he said, "Oh yeah. I meant to tell you about that. I was going to tell you about that. Um, there was a Continental Airlines flight that got in front of us, and as a result, we were delayed by a few minutes. So we took off about 3 minutes later than when we were expecting." He said, "But I'm going to get you to that spot over the Pacific Ocean at 4:13. So we'll be there at 4:13, just a few minutes late." He said, "That'll be all right, won't it?" And when he said that'll be all right, won't it, he must have immediately sensed that it wouldn't be all right. On my face, I could feel the blood rushing out of my face. I just blanched, and my voice must have gone up like 2 octaves when I said, well, Captain Bob, we got to be there at 4:10. If we're there at 4:13, we'll miss the total eclipse. He said, well, why is that? He said, the shadow of the moon, Captain Bob, is moving thousands of miles an hour. He said, if we're there at 4:13, the shadow will have already moved past, and we won't see totality. He said, so what you're saying is I have to make up 3 minutes? He said, yes, can you? Can you? And Captain Bob said, well, I'm a good old boy from Texas. I can do that. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And he said, I said, what are you going to do? He said, we're going to go pedal to the metal. And so he dropped the plane down to 28,000 feet into a little used airway. When you see a plane up in the sky, by the way, it's kind of like, on the ground when you're driving on a highway. Up in the sky, the aircraft is going along an airway. And there was one particular airway that hardly anybody ever uses at a lower altitude. And that's where Captain Bob went. So this way he could, as he said, put pedal to the metal to get into the position that we wanted to get into to see the total eclipse, which would be happening a little after 4:10 Greenwich Mean Time. So here is the video that Sam took. And you're going to hear, now the passengers, there are again about 300 people. Not everybody had a window seat, but they were like lined up in the aisle, 3 and 4 deep, looking straight out the windows that were facing toward the sun to get a view of the eclipse. And here is the video that Sam took as we entered the total phase of the eclipse.
There's Corona. There it is.
And this all came about again by my reading an article in an astronomy magazine, and this and making a couple of phone calls, and here it is. This is a shot that I took from my window with a 500 millimeter lens on Ektachrome film. Again, you remember film, right? Of the diamond ring. Best shot of all was taken by Craig. I mean, when you're like 28,000 feet high, you can get a fantastic view of the giant lunar shadow. And you could see the oval shape of the shadow. Here was the corona of the sun. And for the areas outside of the zone of the shadow, you see it much brighter. You see like sunset colors. Oh, it was a beautiful, beautiful sight. Lasted 73 seconds from the plane, but it was a beautiful view that we had. After we landed in San Francisco, Captain Leary and his navigator Frank Thomas and the flight crew paused to take a photograph with Craig's eclipse flag. And one thing about the flight, a lot of people were interested in the eclipse, but there were a lot of others who were more interested, it seemed, in the movie that they were running on the flight. This was the 1989 Oscar-winning film Driving Miss Daisy, which ended literally just 5 minutes before we encountered the total eclipse. And as Sam mentioned to a reporter from the New York Times, after we had landed and got back to New York, he told that reporter, he says, I don't know where they were driving her. I don't care that they were driving her someplace. I'm just happy that she did get there in time before the eclipse hit total. And there you go. A year later, in 1991 July, we had the big one. This was a total eclipse that was going to last nearly 7 minutes. This was going to be the longest total eclipse of the sun until the year 2150. And this was the one that everybody had been waiting for a very long time because of its long duration of eclipse. Here's the path which went across the Pacific Ocean. And where you see these two red asterisks is where the greatest eclipse would be, just a few seconds shy of 7 minutes of total eclipse. And then the eclipse would continue down through Central America and into South America. But I wasn't here. I was all the way over in this end of the eclipse track in Hawaii, near the big island of Hawaii. Why? Because I had been hired by American Hawaii Cruise Lines, which were sponsoring an eclipse-themed cruise. They were going to hit several of the islands of Hawaii, but they were also going to position their ship, the SS Independence, to see or have the best view of the total eclipse, which from Hawaii would be still pretty good, 4 minutes. And you see in the ad, Joe Rao, meteorologist who will position the SS Independence for the greatest possibility of seeing the spectacle. So everything was on my shoulders to position the ship in the proper location where we'd have the best view with the clear skies for the eclipse. Once again, before we started our adventure, we stopped in at the National Weather Service office. This one was in Honolulu at the airport. Next to Renata and I, you see Hans Rosenthal, the MIC, the meteorologist in charge at the Weather Service there. And you can see that even in Hawaii, they wear garish Hawaiian shirts. Any case, Hans said, "Oh, no problem. I'll stay in touch with you and give you all the latest weather information so that you'll know exactly where to position the ship for the best views of the eclipse." Now, as I said, the big island of Hawaii was in the path of the eclipse. Interestingly, there are two giant volcanic cones. One is Mauna Loa, one is Mauna Kea. In fact, there's an observatory at the summit of Mauna Kea. They're 14,000 feet high. The trade winds, when they blow from the east, as they do in the summertime, they hit the tall mountain or volcanic cones. The air is driven up into the atmosphere and wrung out in the form of clouds and in the form of rain. If you ever go to Hawaii, stay away from Hilo, Hawaii, on the Big Island. They're located all the way on the far end of the eastern end of the island, and because of that effect of the trade winds interacting with the volcanic peaks, they get a lot of rain. In fact, they get about 200 inches of rain per year. It rains almost every day in Hilo. But then as the air goes downslope of the volcanic cones and into the western part of the Big Island, the air is compressed, warmed, dried out, and all the clouds and rain disappear. And the western part of the island is usually bright and sunny. In fact, because the trade winds blow 95% of the time in July, the weather prospects were, hey, you have a 95% chance of seeing or having good weather for the solar eclipse. And that's why literally tens of thousands of people, instead of going to Mexico to get 7 minutes of total eclipse, they went to Hawaii because they said, hey, we'll get 4 minutes, but we'll be almost guaranteed to see the eclipse because the weather is always beautiful in Hawaii in July. Well, two things happened before the eclipse. A month before the eclipse in the Philippines, there was a tremendous volcanic eruption, Mount Pinatubo, which sent into the atmosphere a huge, one of the biggest clouds of ash and dust, an aerosol cloud that within a month enveloped the entire northern hemisphere. So what this meant for us was that instead of the beautiful blue tropical skies that we were hoping for the eclipse, we would have hazy skies because of that cloud of ash and dust. One good point about that was that at sunrise and sunset, we had some gorgeous colors that were visible. Look at that. It was like beet red every evening and every morning. Again, the sunlight interacting with the particulate matter in the high levels of the stratosphere, producing these beautiful red colors. Now, if it was just the volcano and its ash cloud to deal with, that wouldn't have been bad. We would deal with that. But remember I said 95% chance of clear weather? What about the other 5%? What about the chances of well, guess what? The other 5% reared its ugly head over us just in time for the eclipse. This is a view of a tut, a tropical upper tropospheric trough. Very rare. In fact, Hans Rosenthal told me later on, he said, I don't even remember a tut occurring in summertime. It usually occurs in winter or early spring. But here was the tut that enveloped Hawaii the day before the eclipse with cloud cover and also showers, scattered showers. In fact, on the morning of the eclipse, July 11th, I'm on shipboard looking up at the sky. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. The eclipse is going to begin 3.5 hours from now at 6:30 a.m., right after sunrise, and it's drizzling. It's drizzling, and I had no clue where to put the ship. It's my job. I was hired to find clear weather for the eclipse. And when I signed on, I said, well, crazy, 95% chance of clear sky. Of course, we're going to have clear weather for the eclipse. There's no problem. Now there's a problem. 5% chance of cloudy weather. We've got the 5% chance. And no sign, really, of any spot that I could put the ship to see the eclipse. About 1,000 people on board that ship relying on me to position the ship for clear skies. And, you know, people ask me afterwards when I tell them this story, Joe, were you frightened? And I tell them, frightened? You're listening to a man who has laughed in the face of death, sneered at doom, and chuckled at catastrophe. I was petrified. Absolutely. But I made a phone call to Hans at the National Weather Service office in Honolulu. And Hans told me, he said, on our satellite picture, we're beginning to see an opening in the general overcast. There's a hole in the cloud cover that apparently is getting wider about 40 nautical miles to your south and west. He said, if I were you, Joe, I would tell the captain to take the ship in that direction. That may be your salvation. So I told Captain Ha, which was the master of our ship, I told him that. Hans told me. Captain Ha barked a few signals or orders to his crew. The ship made a 90-degree motion or turn, and then all of a sudden, at full bore, 27 knots, the ship lurched forward, and here we are cutting a path toward that area where we were told by the Weather Service had clearing skies. And sure enough, at sunrise, just before the start of the eclipse, it was clear. We, in fact, ended up being inside of a hole in the clouds. All around the horizon, it was cloudy, but where we were, the skies were bright and clear and sunny. Here you see a picture of me and my big-haired sister, Lisa, and what we're doing is we're looking at another ship. There's another ship off on the horizon. We knew that ship. That was the SS Constitution. The Constitution was the sister ship of the ship that we were on, the Independence. They're also owned by American Hawaii Cruises. Hawaii Cruises, our Eclipse cruise was sold out before you could blink an eye. And so they had a long waiting list of people for that cruise. And they finally decided, hey, why don't we put all those people on the waiting list on a second ship? And so they did. So they put it on the Constitution, nicknamed the Connie. We were on the Independence. We were on the Indy. We parked within a mile of each other. We told the Constitution where we were going and where the skies were clear. They followed us, and there we were, the two ships. And here we were waiting for the total eclipse. You see the people on board looking up at the sky and looking at the sun through their filtering devices as the partial phases got underway. And at totality, here's what we saw. Again, admittedly a little hazy, and there were a few thin clouds in the sky, but there was the sun, the beautiful corona, a few bright stars and planets. There's one here and one there. And down below, can you see this area of cloud cover all the way down here? You know what that was? That was the cloud cover that we got out from under. And sadly, that's the cloud cover that settled in over the big island of Hawaii. And so the tens of thousands of people who came to the big island with the intention of seeing the total eclipse, most of them got skunked. Most of them saw nothing because, again, unfortunately, it was cloudy. And what are you going to do? The main purpose of the ship was mobility. I was able to use the mobility of the ship and latest weather forecast to sail out from underneath the clouds to allow us to see the eclipse. We also had on our ship celebrities of some note. Oh, by the way, this is one of the main features of that total eclipse. This was the Seahorse Prominence, a large cloud of hydrogen gas lifting off the surface of the sun, visible at totality, and looked, for all the world, very much like a seahorse. A beautiful sight if you had binoculars or a telescope. And appearing here in this photograph just as the diamond ring, Bailey's beads, was appearing as the sun was getting ready to emerge from totality. The celebrities I referred to, this gentleman on the left was Frederick Pohl. If you're into science fiction, you certainly know who he was. He was one of the most foremost science fiction writers, with possibly the exception of Isaac Asimov. He was on board. This gentleman next to Frederick Pohl was George Keen. He made his mark in the eclipse of 1979, the one that I saw in Montana. He was in Montana too, and he took a beautiful photograph which made the cover of the April edition of Life magazine. He was there, George Keen was, to instruct us on how to take pictures of the eclipse. But the one celebrity which I'll always remember, and with all due respect to George and to Fred, I put above them, was this man next to me, Michael Collins, a name which should be familiar to you. He was an astronaut. He was on board the Apollo 11, the first flight to land men on the surface of the moon. During that cruise, I got to know Mike Collins very well. In fact, one morning I even had a chance to sit down with him for breakfast. Many refer to him as the forgotten astronaut because he was left by himself circling the moon in the command module while his colleagues Armstrong and Aldrin cavorted on the lunar surface. But to me, I was impressed by how gentle Mike was. No envy, no jealousy, no great desire to be anything greater than he was. And he was, at least in my eyes, for all the great people and famous people I've met in my life, certainly among the greatest. In 1998, another total eclipse, another cruise. I was named to be the onboard meteorologist for Celebrity Cruise Lines Galaxy. That was the name of the ship, appropriately enough. And the path of this eclipse crossed from the Pacific over the Panama Canal into the Atlantic, into the Caribbean. We were located off of the island of Montserrat, which had a volcano that was burbling smoke. And we would see the eclipse on February 26, 1998. But a few months before that eclipse, I had the great honor and pleasure and privilege to write a story in Reader's Digest, a family value story. And the story involved my grandfather. I told a story about how he showed me my very first eclipse in the Bronx and how he promised that he would take me to see a total eclipse, which he did in Canada many years later. That article in Reader's Digest. Now, when you get something in Reader's Digest, like at its peak in 1997, 27 million people, 19 different languages. I got a lot of feedback, favorable feedback. But the one thing that I got, well, the one letter or correspondence I got, was a note from a Ms. Barbara M. Vargo from Rapid City, South Dakota. And she wrote to me and said, I was deeply touched by your story in Reader's Digest. I, too, saw the 1925 eclipse like your grandfather. He said, now, I've been carrying something around with me for quite some time, and I've decided now to pass it on to you, as I think you'd make a better home for it. And what she sent to me in that letter was a solar eclipse filter dating back to that January 1925 eclipse. Piece of cardboard with a piece of dark film attached to it, sold for one thin dime, 10 cents. And when she sent that to me, I said, oh my goodness. So I had filters to watch the eclipse on the cruise in 1998, but I got rid of all of them. I discarded all of them. And in honor of my grandfather, who passed away 5 years earlier, I used that 1925 filter to watch that particular 1998 eclipse. And I also got to see totality along with all the passengers on board the ship. And not only did we see a beautiful corona with long streamers, but we also, popping into view at totality, was the planet Jupiter and the planet Mercury. That's one thing you could look for if you're going to be in the total phase of the eclipse in a week coming, is it gets dark enough, like 40 minutes after sunset or 40 minutes before sunrise, dark enough so that you can actually see a few bright stars and planets, as we will see coming up on April the 8th. Then there's the flight that my friend Glenn Schneider, you remember him, he contacted a company called Air Events Polarflug. Polarflug, in the summertime, flies out of Dusseldorf, Germany. And they fly several times a summer from Dusseldorf up to the North Pole. They fly around the North Pole, and then they fly back to Dusseldorf. It's a 12-hour flight. But Glenn contacted Polarflug and said, you know, on August 1st of 2008, there's going to be a total eclipse of the sun that's going to pass not far from the North Pole. He said, why don't you dedicate a flight? You know, I know you go up to the North Pole on several times a summer. Why don't you have a flight leave Dusseldorf on August 1st, fly up, and then you can intercept the shadow of the moon on the way to the North Pole. And he said, I could write you a flight plan. And that indeed is the case. By 2008, Glenn had become pretty well versed in writing up flight plans for aircraft to intercept solar eclipses. And the people on board, the people at Polar Fluke said, that's a heck of a great idea. And they eventually said, yeah, we'll try to see the total eclipse from that airplane on the way to the North Pole. And they actually hired Glenn for a day or two so that he would have access to the cockpit. Here you see him there. He would fly in the cockpit, in the jump seat, and he was going to use the side window here to photograph the eclipse, and he also set up some of his scientific equipment. Now, get this now. This was on August 1st, 2008. 10 days, just 10 days before the flight, Polar Fluke comes to Glenn and says, we are going to get a lot of publicity here in Europe as to what we're going to attempt to do to see the eclipse near the North Pole. He said, but we don't seem to be able to get any publicity from your country, the United States. And they said, do you know of anybody who might be able to get some publicity for us? Somebody in the news media? If you manage to find such a person, we will allow him to come on board for the flight to see the eclipse. He said, free of charge. Well, Glenn was on the phone very quickly to me. And he said, do you have any way that you can get publicity for them? He said, it could mean that you could go on board the flight. And this was something incredible, because to see the North Pole and to see the total eclipse on this flight, window seats on this flight cost anywhere between $10,000 and $12,000. There's no way in the world that I'm going to be able to afford a flight for $12,000 or $10,000. But here, dangling in front of me, was a chance to see and be on board this flight for nothing. All I would have to do was promise that I could get coverage for them in the United States. And I did. I didn't get the TV station that I was working for, but I did manage, because of my affiliation with the American Museum of Natural History. I contacted the magazine that is put out by the museum, Natural History Magazine. They've been around since 1900. And the magazine chronicles major expeditions and research findings by staff members of the American Museum of Natural History and other museums. So I went to the magazine and I said, I have a chance to see a total eclipse of the sun, and at the same time fly around the North Pole. I said, what do you think about that? Would that make a good story for you? And they went out of their gourd. They said, yeah, that would be great. What a great story that would make. Do it. Can you do it? I said, all right, well, I'm going to find out if I'm going to be able to or be allowed to do that. I got back to Glenn, told him. He in turn told Polar Fluke. And then the next day, Glenn called me up on the phone and said 2 words: welcome aboard. And I ended up, so all I would have to do is use my own nickel, my own money, to fly to Dusseldorf and get a hotel room. But then the flight itself, gratis. And it was an incredible, incredible thing for me to be able to go and participate on it. And it was only about a week before. I didn't know this was coming. And a week before, here I am going on this amazing adventure to the North Pole to see a total eclipse. Oh, by the way, here's my boarding pass from Dusseldorf to a fictitious point, wherever that would be along the flight route, to encounter the eclipse, total eclipse shadow. And here was my window. But now, of course, they being Polar Fluke, they're not going to give up a perfectly good window seat costing $10,000 or $12,000. They're not going to give it up to somebody who's not paying anything to be on board that flight. So I said to them, so, well, how am I going to see the eclipse? I need a window. They said, you've got a window. There it is on the escape hatch. If you've ever been on a plane and you see the emergency hatch, there was the hatch. And there's a little tiny circular window about 3 inches wide. And that was going to be my window to see. Now, you're probably saying right now, well, what in the heck can you see through a tiny window like that? And I had to take pictures too. What can you see and how can you take pictures of that? Well, you know what? You can. There was one of my photographs for the eclipse, the diamond ring effect, the shadow falling on clouds beneath us as we flew up toward the North Pole. So I got a chance to see this total eclipse. It lasted for 2 minutes and 55 seconds. And then when we landed back in Dusseldorf, we all of us, the Eclipse Chasers, got out and we posed in front of the plane. It was Air Berlin LTU flight. And here's yours truly. Thumbs up. So happy. If you take a good hard look, that's the same smile that was on my face in 1972 at my very first total eclipse in Canada. And here I am again, all these years later, giving a thumbs up for this eclipse on the North Pole. When I got home, I wrote my article for Natural History magazine, and it made the October edition of Natural History. And to this day, I still do not know, but somebody who read this article decided that it was worth putting up for nomination for an award by the American Astronomical Society, the Popular Writing Award from the AAS. And again, I don't know who was the one who nominated me and put my name up and put the article up for the award, but guess what? It won the award that year from the Solar Physics Division of the AAS, the 2008 Popular Writing Award in the Science Writer category, to me for my article, Shades of Glory, My Whirlwind Tour to the North Pole and Back for 175 Seconds of Totality, published in the October 2008 issue of Natural History. I owe so much to Glenn for making the arrangements, for giving me the opportunity to be on that flight and giving me the chance to write the article and win this incredible award, which, by the way, came with a very nice honorarium, enough so that I was actually able to pay off the airline flight from New York to Dusseldorf. So really, aside from the hotel room, this flight for seeing this eclipse cost nothing, pretty much, for me. It was again, and it was an amazing situation. Then in 2016, and this will be the last eclipse that we're going to talk about out of the all the ones that I've gone to. In 2016, there was an eclipse that was going to pass over Indonesia. And a lot of my eclipse chasing buddies were, blanking and moaning. I'm not going to say this because it's a family show, but you know what the blanking meant. About the fact that it was Indonesia. Oh my God, Indonesia? I don't feel like going to New Guinea or Sumatra, and I may have to take some shots because there may be some disease or whatever that I have to get a vaccine for or whatever, or plant. And I have to get the passport out and do all thing. But I looked at this eclipse track and I said, you know what? Look at the track of the total eclipse. And way over here, toward the end of the eclipse track, here's Honolulu and here's Alaska. And I said, I wonder if there's any flights going from Alaska to Honolulu or from Honolulu to Alaska, and that might possibly intercept the shadow of the moon, and we might actually see the eclipse from the aircraft. And you remember what I did back in 1990? Well, I'm going to attempt to do it again in 2016. This time I didn't have to rely on the official airline guide. This time I had the internet, and within just a very short time, I found a prospective flight. Alaska Airlines. Alaska Airlines had a flight 870, which flew from Anchorage, Alaska to Honolulu. And I pointed out to Alaska Airlines that if they delayed the flight by 25 minutes, now remember in 1990 with American Transair, it was 41 minute delay, but I said, if you can delay the flight by 25 minutes, you'll get everybody on board that aircraft, the passengers, the crew, a chance to see a total eclipse of the sun. And they mulled it over for a little bit. And I also showed them pictures, and I also showed them newspaper and magazine articles about the successful flight we had in 1990. I said, all of this good publicity could be yours in 2016 if you do it. And you know what? They said yes. They said, this is great. We'll do it. And so on March the 8th, March the 8th, 2016, they were going to fly from Anchorage to Honolulu. They're going to delay the flight by 25 minutes, flight 870. This is part of the news release, the press release that they had put out, and they got a ton of great publicity. There were TV stations on board with us covering the event, and I had my own bunch of Eclipse buddies with their high-definition cameras on board, and each one of them said the same thing to me. We're going to be very happy if we're successful to send you or give you copies of what we shoot. And you know what I did with all of that? And also with one of the TV stations on board, I took all of that and made it into my own news package, which was aired on News 12 after we all got back to the United States, back to the Hudson Valley. I said back to the United States. We never left the United States, for goodness sake. Anchorage, Alaska, that's one of our 50 states. And Honolulu, that's our 49th state, 50th state. Anchorage, Alaska is our 49th state. Honolulu or Hawaii is our 50th state. And so we never needed passports. We didn't have to get shots. We didn't have to go to Indonesia to see this. And the flight plan was written up by my friend Glenn. And after he wrote the flight plan and passed it along to Alaska Airlines, they detailed it into the official flight intercept project. And the night before the eclipse, here is Captain Hal Anderson. He was our captain on board this flight. He was actually not assigned to this originally, but when he was an amateur astronomer too, and when he found out that the airline was going to attempt to intercept an eclipse of the sun, he went to the hierarchy and he almost got on bended knees and said, "Can I be on board this flight? Can I fly? Can I get in the cockpit? Can I fly?" They said, "Look, if you're so into this, you be the guy who will fly the eclipse flight." And so the night before, with 10 of my eclipse chasing buddies who didn't go to Indonesia, they came on board this flight. So here's Captain Anderson detailing how he's going to fly the plane and get into the zone of the eclipse. Here is the day of the event. Before we got on board, I was able to get some high altitude wind information to give to Captain Anderson. And now I'm going to show you the report that I did after we had gotten back to the Hudson Valley, the report that I did. And what's interesting is everything you're going to see in my report. Normally, you know, we'd send a cameraman to shoot a report with the reporter. No cameraman from News 12. Everything that you see in this report was shot either by some of my friends with their high-def cameras for the eclipse, or a piece of this was also shot by KOMO Seattle, which was on board the flight. They were the ABC affiliate. They shot and they allowed us to use some of their raw footage for the eclipse. And I took all of that, came back, sat down with an editor at News 12, and we put together this report of my solar eclipse adventure for that event.
Now to a News 12 special report. Not many people get the chance to see a solar eclipse from the air, but our chief meteorologist convinced a major airline to alter the path of one of its regularly scheduled flights to give passengers and crew a chance to experience an incredible celestial sight. Here's Joe Rao's remarkable story, Into the Eclipse.
Oh my God, look at it. Here comes a shadow. Look at that. It's like a tornado. Oh my God, here we go.
Exclamations of wonder from a person witnessing a sight that few people in their lifetime ever get a chance to see. This is the shadow of the moon streaking silently over the Pacific Ocean at 7,000 miles per hour, about to rendezvous with a commercial jet aircraft just prior to the start of the most awe-inspiring sight the heavens can offer, a total eclipse of the sun.
Totality! Totality!
But it was the circumstances of how this flight came about that garnered national attention.
We are about to embark on a trip that a lot of people are calling historic here. Now, a second ago, I spoke to the man who actually did this whole process. A year ago, Joe Rao noticed that this path of the eclipse was going to cross between Hawaii and Alaska, and he contacted Alaska Air to make this special flight happen.
And that's how, in the dead of winter, I found myself heading to Ted Stevens International Airport in beautiful Anchorage, Alaska, on a day where the Alaskan mountains sparkle and plane tickets promised Hawaii. Waiting for me at the gate was Captain Hal Anderson of Alaska Airlines, who was going to pilot our journey into darkness.
It's a rare privilege to see a total eclipse, particularly from 37,000 feet.
I think Alaska Airlines should be congratulated because most other airlines just give you an in-flight movie. We're going to go one better than that, much better than that. We're going to give you a chance to see something you may never see again, a total solar eclipse. That's the promise I made to all the passengers as we boarded a packed 737 jet en route to Honolulu, where the in-flight entertainment began with a pair of eclipse safety glasses. And soon, everyone on board began to get into place for the big show in the sky. The dark silhouette of the moon was about to begin crossing directly in front of the disk of the sun. First, just a small bite cutting into the bottom of the sun. And as the minutes ticked off, that bite became progressively larger, and larger, and larger still, cutting the sun down to a narrow crescent. In the final moments before totality, just like curtain time before a Broadway play, the light rapidly dimmed. Then, 700 miles north of Honolulu, the main event. Sun, moon, plane, perfectly aligning for a perfect moment.
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Oh, yes. Once in a lifetime.
Time just stopped. The eclipse was frozen above us, like a phenomenal photograph pasted on the dome of the sky. The incredible corona, the crown of the sun, was now in full view. Study of this solar atmosphere is one of the main scientific benefits from an eclipse. More is being learned about the corona all the time. Some believe it may have an effect on the Earth's weather. But time was not standing still. After just 113 seconds, the moon's movement brought forth a second sunrise, ending the late afternoon darkness that had stretched across the horizon. Passengers were still in awe.
You could see that thing coming at you, both sides of it, like a blanket being thrown toward your face.
I have never seen one before, and it was spectacular, especially when the moon was totally over the sun.
Spectacular and eerie at the same time. Most on board soon came to realize that for them, such an amazing sight may never come again, proving that age-old saying is true. Why worry about your destination when the journey looks like this? Joe Rao, News 12, airborne above the North Pacific.
Well, folks, I've been belittling here for, my God, more than an hour and a half. I don't know what else I could do. I know that a lot of you are looking forward to this event. A lot of you are probably saying to yourself, well, I'll stay in Rockland to watch the partial eclipse. I'm hoping that I have convinced some of you, maybe all of you, I hope. I don't have the power to drag all of you up to the zone of the total eclipse, but I tell you true, if you want to experience an event which you're going to remember for the rest of your life, the most spectacular phenomena, natural phenomena that you will ever see, and it's being delivered to you literally almost at your doorstep. Take a few hours out. Hey, you want to find a good excuse not to go into work on a Monday, not this Monday, but the following Monday. Here's your excuse, a chance to see something that really will not be visible in such close proximity to us again until the year 2079. I don't know about you. I don't intend to be here in 2079. That's why I chase them and go as many times as I can when it's within reason to see total eclipses. So I hope all of you get your chance and do take advantage of this. Hopefully, and I've been telling people are saying, Joe, why has it been so cruddy this winter? Why is it almost every day seems like it's cloudy or especially rainy or whatever? And I've been telling them this. Nature has been getting all of the cruddy weather, all the lousy weather out of the way so that when we get to April the 8th, hopefully we'll have nice clear weather, nice beautiful skies for us to all enjoy this rare celestial phenomenon. So I thank all of you for listening. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy now to answer them for you. And I thank you again for listening and attending. And thanks again to the Blauvelt Free Library for hosting another one of my presentations.